Home alone. Lights off. Doors locked. You think you're safe until you hear the first sound. A creak on the stairs. A face in the window. A whisper from the closet. These aren't ghost stories. They're real accounts of people who were alone until they weren't. What followed wasn't just fear. It was survival. These true stories will make you double-check your locks and wonder who might be watching you right now. Rhythm of the Intruder. My friend sent this story in a while back. He said it was an experience his cousin Liam had when he was just 18 years old. He lived with his dad and his new stepmom, and for the first time in a while, he had the whole house to himself. His dad and stepmom were off on their honeymoon for a full week, and Liam was looking forward to a solid 7 days of doing whatever he wanted. The house was a nice 2-story suburban home, a little on the old side, but that just added to its character. Liam was a pretty quiet kid, not much for parties, so his plan was to spend the week gaming, eating junk food, and just generally enjoying the solitude. On the third night, he was up late playing an old RPG on his Xbox. He was in his brother's old room, which had been converted into a game room after his brother moved out for college. The room was on the second floor, facing the back garden. It was a pretty peaceful spot, but at about 2 a.m., he started hearing this strange noise. It was a faint scraping sound, almost like someone dragging something heavy over concrete. He figured it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, rummaging through the trash cans in the backyard. He turned his headset up a little louder and tried to ignore it, but the noise persisted. It wasn't the kind of random scratching you'd expect from a raccoon. This was rhythmic, methodical, almost as if someone was deliberately dragging something along the foundation of the house. It got louder too. The scraping moved from the ground level to somewhere directly beneath his window. The sound was distinct now, a coarse scratching sound against the brickwork, followed by the clinking of something metallic. It wasn't just a raccoon anymore. Raccoons don't climb brick walls. A wave of unease washed over Liam. He paused his game and pulled off his headset. The silence in the house was deafening, except for the insistent scraping just outside the window. He moved slowly and cautiously toward the window, pulling aside the blinds just a crack. It was pitch black outside. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp at the end of the cul-de-sac. He strained to see something, anything, but there was nothing visible. Still, the scraping continued. It sounded like it was right there, just a few feet below his window. He felt a sudden chill, a sense of being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was making the noise knew he was there. Instead of closing the blinds, he did something incredibly stupid. He cracked the window open a couple of inches to get a better listen, thinking maybe he could figure out what the sound was before he called his dad or the police. He stood there for a few seconds, listening. The scraping had stopped. The only sound now was the low hum of the air conditioner and the crickets outside. He figured maybe he had imagined it. Turning away from the window, he took a step toward his desk to put his headphones back on. That's when he heard it, the faint creak of the window frame behind him, the whisper of air as it was pushed open further. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. He slowly turned his head. The window was now completely open and a figure was halfway inside. A man, dressed in dark clothing, was climbing through the window. Liam could only see his head and shoulders. The rest of his body was still outside. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was obscured by the shadows and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. For a split second, they just stared at each other. Liam couldn't move. He was in a state of pure terror. Then, the man started to pull his leg up over the windowsill. That's when Liam's survival instincts kicked in. He didn't think. He just reacted. He lunged forward and slammed his shoulder into the man's chest. It was a desperate, panicked shove, but it was enough. The man gasped, lost his footing, and toppled backward out of the window. Liam heard a sickening thud, followed by a rustling of leaves and the sound of branches snapping. He looked out the window just in time to see the man get up from a large rose bush below. He stumbled for a second before turning and sprinting away into the darkness, limping slightly. Liam immediately slammed the window shut and locked it. He then ran to the front door, made sure it was locked, and then called his dad. His dad, who was on the other side of the country, was obviously concerned. He told Liam to call the police and to stay on the phone with him until they arrived. Liam did exactly that, but by the time the police got there, the man was long gone. They looked around, and all they found was a rusty old ladder leaning against the side of the house and a single shoe in the rosebush. The police took a report, but they said there wasn't much they could do. They told him to be more careful in the future. For the rest of the week, Liam stayed locked in his room with the lights on, only leaving to get food and use the bathroom. He kept the TV on all night just to have some background noise. He couldn't shake the image of that man's face in the window, his eyes looking straight into his. He's moved out since then, and he still can't be alone in a house at night without feeling a strange sense of dread. The silence now feels like an intruder itself, and the sound of a simple scraping noise outside will likely haunt him for the rest of his life. The Storm Visitor. Ian lived with his mom on Long Island, and one stormy Saturday night she was out of town visiting his grandmother, so he had the house all to himself. He was not a fan of being alone, especially not during a bad storm, so he invited his friend Carl over to hang out for a while. It was a pretty bad storm, the kind of rain where you can hear the wind howling outside and the leaves and branches are scraping against the side of the house. Ian was in the living room, setting up the TV for a night of gaming, when he heard a text come through. It was Carl. The text read, "Just pulled up. Be there in 2 minutes." Ian's spirits lifted. He was glad to have some company. He was just about to head to the front door when he heard a distinct click, followed by the familiar squeak of his back gate closing. The back gate led to his small backyard, which was mostly just a lawn, a deck, and an old shed at the back. It was strange that Carl would go in through the back gate. Maybe he thought he was pulling a prank. Ian thought nothing of it. "Carl, you weirdo!" he yelled out jokingly, but there was no response. Confused, Ian decided to go and check it out. He opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The storm was in full swing now, and the rain was coming down in sheets. He squinted his eyes and looked toward the back of the yard. That's when he saw it. The door to his shed, which was always kept locked and closed, was standing wide open. What's more, there was a faint yellow light on inside, casting a strange glow out onto the lawn. "Carl?" he called out again, his voice a little less playful and a little more cautious this time. He got no reply, just the sound of the wind and the rain. He started walking slowly toward the shed, his shoes squishing in the wet grass. "Dude, come on, stop messing around, it's too rainy for this." Just as he got about halfway to the shed, the light inside flickered and then went out completely, plunging the backyard into darkness. A chill ran down Ian's spine. It felt like something was wrong. He stopped walking and stood there for a second, trying to process what was happening. At the same time, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hand shaking slightly. It was another text from Carl. The text read, "I'm here." Ian, completely freaked out now, texted back, "Are you in the shed?" He waited, staring at the empty, dark shed, and then a new text message popped up on his screen. "I'm at the front door." A cold, heavy dread settled in his stomach. If Carl was at the front door, who was in the shed? Ian looked back up at the shed, and as if on cue, the door slowly started to close from the inside, with a loud final slam that echoed through the backyard. Without a second thought, Ian turned and sprinted back to the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled with the lock, threw the back door open, and ran through the house to the front door. He unlocked it and let a very wet and confused Carl inside. Ian, breathless and terrified, tried to explain what had just happened. Carl, seeing the genuine terror in his friend's eyes, believed him right away. They called the police, and a few minutes later, 2 officers showed up. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by now, and the officers went out to the backyard to check the shed. They found the door standing open again, but the light was off, and there was no sign of anybody inside. The officers checked the perimeter, but they couldn't find any footprints other than Ian's. They said it was probably just the wind, but Ian knew what he saw. He knew what he heard, and he knew that the shed door hadn't slammed shut on its own. To this day, he he still refuses to go into the shed. He says that the memory of that door closing, of knowing someone was in there watching him, is enough to keep him away forever. Scream in the basement. Chris, a 45-year-old with a family, lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. On a Tuesday night in early fall, Chris was scheduled to work late, so his wife and 2 kids went out to dinner without him. But as luck would have it, his boss sent everyone home early. The house was completely dark and quiet when he pulled into the driveway, a welcome silence after a long day at the office. He figured his family wouldn't be home for at least another 2 hours, so he decided to make the most of it. He went straight down to his man cave in the basement, an unfinished part of the basement with a TV and an old recliner. The perfect place to relax without any interruptions. He poured himself a drink and settled into his recliner to watch some sports. He was just getting comfortable when he heard a noise. It was a faint sound, like a metallic click coming from the far wall of the basement. He looked over to the noise, where there was a small waist-high window that faced the backyard. The window had been open a crack to let in some fresh air. The click he heard was the sound of the window being pushed open all the way. Chris froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as a hand came through the open window, followed by a head. A man wearing a dark hoodie was peering into the room, his eyes scanning the space. Chris held his breath, sinking lower into the recliner. The man didn't see him. He just looked around the empty room for a few seconds before pulling his head back out and shutting the window with another click. For a moment, Chris just sat there terrified. He had no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but he knew he couldn't stay in the basement. He moved quickly and silently, sneaking up the stairs. He went to the closet by the front door and grabbed his old aluminum baseball bat. He then ran through the house, turning off all the lights until the house was completely dark. He stood in the kitchen by the back door, the bat held tightly in his hands. He knew that if the guy was going to try and get in, he'd most likely try the back door first. It was the only one in the house with a doggy door. Chris waited, his body tense with fear. He heard a noise outside, the faint crunching of leaves. Then a few seconds later, he heard a scraping sound coming from the back door. The small flap of the pet door was pushed open, and then he saw it, a hand reaching through, trying to feel for the lock. Chris didn't hesitate. He swung the baseball bat as hard as he could, aiming for the man's arm. There was a sickening crack, followed by a gut-wrenching scream. The hand was instantly pulled back, and Chris heard the man stumble and then run away, his screams fading into the night. Chris, shaking with adrenaline, immediately called the police. As he was on the phone, he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens, but they weren't coming to his house. He watched from his front window as 2 police cars and an ambulance pulled up to a house just a few doors down. He saw a woman, his neighbor's wife, standing outside in tears as police officers walked in and out of the house. The next day, he found out what had happened. The police had discovered that Chris's neighbor had passed away in his kitchen. The house had been ransacked, and several valuable items had been stolen. The cause of death was identified as a stab wound, and it was his wife who had found him lying on the kitchen floor. The police informed Chris that the man had likely lost his life after returning home early from work just as Chris had. The suspect turned out to be a former felon with a long history of home invasions. He was caught and arrested later that same day at a nearby hospital, where he had gone to seek treatment for a broken arm. Chris said that to this day, he still feels sick to his stomach whenever he thinks about that night. He often wonders whether, had he not come home early that evening, it might have been his house that was broken into and his own body lying on the kitchen floor. He said the sound of that man's scream will forever be seared into his memory. The Waiters. Anne went through a strange experience when she was a teenager. She was 16 at the time and was home alone on a snowy Friday night in early winter. Her parents had gone out for dinner, and her younger sister was at a sleepover. Anne was looking forward to a quiet night, so she decided to take a nap before watching a movie. The snow was coming down pretty hard and the wind was howling outside. She was sleeping soundly, dreaming a light dream, when she was jolted awake by a sudden loud thud. The sound was distinct and sharp, and it seemed to have come from inside her room. She lay there in the dark, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears listening for a second noise, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind rattling the window panes. She sat up in her bed and looked around her room. Her eyes landed on her closet door, which was slightly ajar. The thud, she realized, had come from the closet. A wave of unease washed over her. She knew the closet door had been completely closed when she went to sleep. She figured the wind must have blown it open or something, but a feeling of dread was starting to set in. She slowly got out of bed, her feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. She walked over to the closet and stood there for a moment, her hand on the doorknob. She took a deep breath, preparing to open it. She pulled the door open and the closet was empty. She felt a wave of relief. She was about to close the door and go back to bed when she heard a rustling sound behind her. She spun around, and that's when she saw it. There was a head peeking out from under her bed. It was the head of a man, and he was staring directly at her. His expression was cold and blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. Anne let out a blood-curdling scream and fell to the floor, scrambling backward, her eyes locked on his. At the same time, the closet doors behind her suddenly swung open, and a pair of hands grabbed her from behind and pulled her inside. She screamed and fought, but her captor was too strong. She was now being held down by two men. One was the man from the closet, and the other was the man who had been under her bed. They were both wearing dark clothing, and both of their faces were expressionless. One of them put a piece of tape over her mouth, and the other tied her hands together with some kind of cord. They then dragged her out of the closet and down the hallway. She tried to kick and scream, but all she could make was a muffled whimper. They carried her down the stairs and toward the back door. She saw a third man standing by the door holding a bag. She realized they were planning to take her. One of the men opened the back door and looked out into the snowy night, making sure no one was outside. The coast was clear. They carried her out into the cold night and started walking toward a car that was parked a little way down the street. It was a dark sedan with its engine running. They were about halfway to the car when she heard a sound. It was the sound of voices and bike tires on the snowy street. A large group of teenagers, maybe a dozen of them, came riding down the street on their bikes. They were laughing and talking, but they all stopped when they saw what was happening. Anne's captor stopped too, and for a moment, everyone just stared at each other. Then, one of the teenagers screamed, and a few others got off their bikes and started to slowly approach them. The two men knew they were caught. They dropped Anne, ran to their car, and sped away, leaving Anne in the snow. The teenagers rushed over to her and untied her, and one of them, a girl, immediately called the police. The police arrived a few minutes later, but the men were long gone. The officers took a report, but they said there wasn't much they could do. They never found the men. Anne said she was in a state of shock for days after that night. The thought of those men watching her, waiting for her to wake up, and then ambushing her. It was a chilling thought. She said the most terrifying part was the look in their eyes. There was no rage or anger, just a cold, blank stare that made her feel like a piece of meat. She still has nightmares about it to this day, and she still can't shake the feeling that those men were doing it for fun. She says she often wonders why they didn't just tie her up while she was sleeping. Maybe, she says, they just wanted to see the look on her face when she realized what was happening. Come outside. 22-year-old Garber still lived with his parents, but since he was the youngest of three, his older siblings had already moved out, and his parents were often out of the house a few nights a week. This one particular night, his parents were out to dinner and he had the whole place to himself. It was a cold, rainy night in late fall, and the wind was howling outside. Garber was in his room playing video games when he heard a thump at his window. He didn't think much of it, as the weather was pretty bad, and he figured a branch or something had just hit the glass. But a few seconds later, another more forceful thump hit his window and his heart started to race. This wasn't a branch. He slowly and cautiously got out of his chair and crept toward the window. He pulled the blinds aside and peered out into the darkness. Even through the rain-streaked glass, he could see a figure standing on the lawn below, looking up at his window. He couldn't make out the man's face, but he knew he didn't recognize him. Garber immediately dropped the blinds, thinking that maybe if the man knew he had been seen, he would leave. But before Garber could even take a step back from the window, another object was thrown at the glass, and this time, it was a rock. The sound was loud and jarring, and Garber's heart was pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't just sit there and let this guy break his window. In a fit of adrenaline-fueled frustration, he threw the blinds back open, unlocked the window, and shouted down, "What do you want?" The man on the lawn, his voice muffled by the rain, shouted back, "Come outside. I want to show you something." Garber's blood ran cold. He slammed the window shut, locked it, and immediately ran downstairs to call the police. He locked the front and back doors and made sure all the windows were locked on the first floor. He then picked up the house phone and dialed 911. The operator was calm and collected as he explained the situation. "Did the man cause any damage to the window?" she asked. "Do you know who he is?" Garber answered no to both questions. The operator, sounding a little less concerned now, told him to call back if the man caused any damage, tried to break in, or continued to harass him. Garber, feeling a little dismissed, hung up the phone. He wanted to get a better look at the man, so he went into the kitchen, which had a big window facing the backyard. He slowly and cautiously pulled aside the blinds and looked out. The man was gone. He felt a wave of relief, thinking the man had finally given up and left. But as he was about to turn away from the window, he heard a noise. A faint scratching noise coming from the window right next to him. He looked down, and through the glass, he saw the man. He was standing right there just a few feet away, looking directly at him. His face was soaked from the rain, and his expression was still cold and blank. Garber recoiled in horror, a scream catching in his throat. He immediately ran back to the house phone and called 911 again. "He's at my kitchen window now," he stammered into the phone. "You have to send somebody right away." The operator, hearing the genuine terror in his voice, told him to stay on the line and that an officer was on the way. Garber, still on the phone with the operator, took one more look at the kitchen window. The man was gone. The police arrived about 5 minutes later, but they couldn't find anyone. They checked the backyard and the surrounding area, but there were no footprints in the mud or any signs that anyone had been there. They told Garber to be more careful in the future and to call them immediately if he saw anything else. That was the last time Garber ever saw that man. He said he still thinks about it sometimes, and he still can't shake the feeling that the man wasn't just trying to scare him. He thinks that maybe the man was just looking for a house to break into and that he was just a lucky victim who was home to stop it. He says that the most terrifying part of the whole experience was the look in the man's eyes, a cold, empty stare that told him that this wasn't the first time he had done something like this.